Hi everyone, welcome to the Sophos MDR ThreatCast March 2025 edition. My name is Greg Ed and I'm the the services architect for MDR. Not that I had a job title change recently. Joining me, we've got a host of regular faces and Dan, who's really pretty new. Dan, I think it's his second time here. So we've got Dan Inglis from the Threat Intelligence team, as well as Morgan Domboski from the Threat Intelligence team. And we've also got Pavlo Kulam from Threat Hunt. In terms of what we'll be covering today, the usual things you're expecting. We're going to do threat landscape with Dan. Move on to then the observed threat activity. This is what we've actually been seeing here in MDR. And then Pavlo's going to take us through a few interesting hunts. One of those was pretty new to me, so make sure you stick around for that. I'll take us through most unwanted, which has come back. As always, people always nudge me saying, hey, can you please do that again? So I've brought that section back. There's some quite topical stuff that you'll see and observe that relates to that. And then we'll take Q&A at the end. We're not joined by anyone from XOps and the threat research team today due to just workload and so on. So hopefully, if there's any questions that's more tailored towards research that's come up, we'll take that and send that to them, and we'll get back to you on it. All right. So as always, if you have a question, you'll see on, I believe, the right-hand side of your screen will be a Q&A box. I don't think we've got it enabled to let people's questions pop up just because of people's names. I don't think this platform currently supports anonymized questions yet. So do fire in your question. That will show to us. We'll either answer it live. I'll step in, pose that question to the presenter, or we'll answer it via text, or we'll hold on to it and we'll take it in the Q&A section at the end. Everyone always asks this, are we recording? Can I get the slides? Can I get the recording? Yes, you can get the recording. It'll be uploaded to the MDR community channel roughly within the next 24 hours. And then about 10 or so days later, we actually put it on our YouTube channel. So if you search Sophos XOps on YouTube, you can find that there. And hello, anyone who's watching this in the future on YouTube. All right, thanks so much. What we're going to do is call Dan to the stage. And Dan, want to take us through the threat landscape? Take it away, Dan.
Great. Oh, awesome. All right. Thanks, Greg. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for attending this month's ThreatCast. We've got a fair bit of content to cover, so we'll jump right in. First up, we have 3 vulnerabilities in VMware products that are being actively exploited. So what makes this particularly concerning is that attackers can chain these vulnerabilities together in order to escape the virtual machine's sandbox and take control of the hypervisor. So while these vulnerabilities impact a number of products, VMware ESXi is particularly vulnerable because as a bare metal hypervisor, ESXi runs directly on hardware without any underlying operating system. So unlike traditional OS-based environments, ESXi doesn't support EDR tools or AV software or any other type of traditional security agents, and this can make this a potential blind spot for defenders. Additionally, because ESXi is widely used in cloud infrastructure and enterprise data centers, the potential impact here could be quite significant. So this beautiful graphic from Kevin Beaumont describes the risks quite well. So by chaining these vulnerabilities together, an attacker can move from the compromised virtual machine directly into the hypervisor. And then once they have access to the hypervisor, they can access pretty much anything on the ESXi server. So this includes any data from VMs, configurations, as well as attached storage. It's important to note, though, that in order to exploit these vulnerabilities, the attacker must first have root or admin access to one of the host images. And while VMware doesn't typically recommend deploying endpoint agents to these virtual images due to potential performance issues, this can be quite an effective way to prevent exploitation before it's even attempted. I should add that if you're considering going down this route, it's really important to provide enough resources to the VM in order to power the endpoint agent. So for example, a minimum of 2 cores is typically the recommended minimum, sorry. Additionally, patches have been released for all products. So if you're using any of these products, it's really important to patch as soon as possible because these vulnerabilities are being actively exploited. Okay, up next, we have Apache Tomcat. So this is a story that really highlights how quickly cyber threats can evolve in today's landscape. So on March 10th, Apache discovered a critical vulnerability in their Tomcat server software, which is the backbone of many Java-based web applications. What makes this particularly interesting is the timeline. So within about 30 hours of initial disclosure, proof of concept exploit code was already published, and then the following day, exploitation in the wild began. So the vulnerability itself is extremely simple to exploit, which likely contributed to this escalated timeline. So basically, attackers could take over a server with a single put request, and what they would do is they would send a put request to upload a malicious session file, which contained an encoded Java payload. Then by sending a GET request with the session ID that points to this session file, they could trigger deserialization and execution of that payload, thereby granting them full access to the server. So there's a silver lining here. While the vulnerability is quite severe and trivial to exploit, it's only exploitable if specific conditions are met. And according to Mark Thomas from the Tomcat project, the vast majority of Tomcat installations will not be affected due to these specific requirements. But for me, the takeaway here isn't about this specific vulnerability. It's more so about how quickly these situations can evolve. So from disclosure to exploitation in less than 3 days really shows how important effective patch management is. It's also important to mention that because Tomcat is an application server, you may not even realize that you're using it. So if you're using any type of Java-based web application, for example, the odds are you're using Apache Tomcat. This is why it's really important to have a complete understanding of your entire software inventory. And the last vulnerability I wanted to mention here is a software supply chain compromise that unfolded across multiple GitHub actions this month. So GitHub Actions is a CI/CD platform that helps users automate their development pipeline. And individual GitHub Actions can become a reusable workflow component that multiple pipelines can use. So this incident started when it was discovered that a popular GitHub action called TJ Actions changed files had been compromised. So the attackers had quietly modified some code and updated the version tags to include their malicious payload. You can kind of think of this as like secretly changing the recipe in a cookbook that thousands of chefs use every day. So the real kicker here is that it was later discovered this wasn't the beginning of the story, and the attack actually started from another tool called Action Setup. And this was then used to compromise the change files action itself. So the attackers were particularly interested in getting their hands on sensitive CI/CD secrets, which are things like AWS access keys, GitHub tokens, and RSA keys. What makes this especially concerning here is that these secrets are being exposed in workflow logs. So for public repositories, this essentially means that sensitive information could have been sitting there in plain sight for anyone to access. The good news, though, the response is pretty swift, and as a result, there's a limited time frame in which the malicious action was live. However, if you think you may have been affected, you should first update the latest clean version, then audit your workflow logs for any of this compromised data. And if you have been compromised, you'll need to rotate these secret keys. So looking ahead, GitHub has actually made some suggestions for developers as well. So for example, if you're using version tags like v3 or main, pinning these actions to specific commit hashes is much safer. And again, what really stands out about this incident to me is how interconnected these development tools can be, and how one compromise quickly led to another, creating this cascading effect that impacted thousands of projects. So it really emphasizes the importance of securing your software supply chains, as well as being cautious about what third-party tools we trust. All right, so let's move on from some vulnerabilities. So in mid-February, over 200,000 private messages from Black Bass's internal chat were posted to Telegram. So we first discussed this leak last month, actually, but at the time we were just beginning to scratch the surface. And since then, both our team, alongside the broader intelligence community, have been conducting extensive analysis on this data. These leaked chat logs have provided some fascinating insights, revealing everything from day-to-day operations to their strategic planning. So now that we got a chance to dig a bit further into these leaks, I wanted to highlight a couple interesting findings. So one thing I think was particularly interesting about how they operated is their structure. So Black Bass operators had at least 2 physical offices in the Moscow area, complete with regular employees who showed up to work just like any other company. So this heat map here on the right really shows that the vast majority of messages occurred between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. Moscow time, Monday through Friday. On top of this, they had a whole network of independent contractors that they'd bring in for everything from making phone calls to writing malware. And these contractors played a very crucial role in what became one of their common attack strategies. Additionally, all these workers ultimately reported to someone by the name of Gigi or Tramp. This individual is often referred to as boss throughout the chats and likely has some affiliations with the Conti ransomware group. Okay, here's how one method typically worked. So using these outsourced call centers and social engineering specialists, they would execute carefully choreographed attacks. So first, what they would do is they would flood someone's email inbox with an overwhelming amount of spam. We're talking about the levels of thousands of messages per hour here. Then, while the target was struggling to manage these emails, they'd receive a call through Microsoft Teams from someone claiming to be from their IT support team. So this combination of email bombing along with voice phishing or vishing proved to be remarkably effective, especially since attackers could leverage legitimate tools like Microsoft's Quick Assist to take control of the victim's computer. So the Sophos MDR team published a detailed report about this campaign in January, actually. So if you're looking for more technical information, I highly recommend checking out that report. While this campaign proved to be very successful, this wasn't the only way they broke into networks. The group is also known to exploit vulnerabilities in edge devices like firewalls or VPN appliances. And the leaked chat logs showed they focused on well-known vulnerabilities rather than developing their own novel exploits. And also, if the opportunity looked promising enough, they would purchase access from outside cybercriminals. To me, what made Black Bastard particularly dangerous wasn't their technical sophistication. It was more so their ability to orchestrate these multi-level attacks with surprising precision. And so this is the approach that ultimately led them to compromise over 500 organizations worldwide across various critical sectors. So these leaked chats have provided us with unprecedented visibility into their operations. We can now see exactly how they selected targets, moved through networks, and conducted negotiations. And this is the type of intelligence that's proving invaluable for developing more effective defenses against future attacks. But there are some things you can do today to protect yourself against Black Bastard and similar groups. So things like implementing a patch management solution for all systems, and especially these edge devices. So part of the solution should be monitoring the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. This can help prioritize patching for vulnerabilities that are being actively exploited. Additionally, deploying EDR agents to all endpoints, as well as training employees to recognize social engineering attempts like this vishing their teams. And finally, to wrap up the landscape section, I want to take a quick look at some recent ransomware leak site activity. So as you can see here, Hunters, Termite, Ransom House are all on the rise, whereas Bashi, Everest, and Flocker have all dropped off significantly since last month. One group I want to highlight is Ransom House. This group doesn't actually encrypt anything in their attacks like typical ransomware group would. Instead, they choose to focus on data exfiltration only for extortion. So this is known as an encryptionless extortion, and it's becoming a growing tactic as it's been less noisy compared to traditional ransomware attacks. It's also simpler to execute because there's no need to develop a custom encryption tool. And it's a trend that we're going to see more of in the future. Yep. And with that, that concludes our threat landscape section. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'll pass things over to Morgan to discuss our observed threat activity.
Thank you very much, Dan. Hey everyone, how's it going? Really excited to dive into some observed threat activity today. So let's go ahead and get started. So starting off with some trends, and specifically ransomware. So in terms of observed ransomware families, as of recent, we've actually been able to link many ransomware incidents impacting our customers to clusters of activity that we're tracking. So for instance, over the past month plus or so, we've seen several compromises leading to the deployment of Akira or Inc. ransomware. And a lot of this activity has actually been related to a new cluster of activity that we're tracking called Stack 3524. And this stack is currently under investigation, but what it is it's associated with initial access activity abusing Sophos VPN/XG firewall. And we'll very likely cover this stack and this initial access tactic more in depth next ThreatCast, but we have observed several incidents across the Sophos customer base aligning with this cluster of activity, which have led to a range of post-exploit activity, including data exfiltration and the deployment of Akira or Inc. ransomware. Keylin, which is also known as Agenda ransomware, is another ransomware family that we've seen a lot of ongoing activity with, much of which is also associated with another new activity cluster that we're tracking called Stack 4365. And this stack is actually known to target MSPs and deploy compromised Screen Connect instances in order to compromise their downstream customers, so the downstream customers of those MSPs, and with the goal of deploying Keylin ransomware. So we have seen several compromises involving Keylin as of recent. And we've talked about fog ransomware several times in the past, but I wanted to touch on one that we may have not talked about as much, and that is DragonForce. So DragonForce is a ransomware as a service that popped up around August 2023. And at first they were using a variant of a leaked Lockbit 3.0 builder, but more recently in July of 2024, they announced that they had their own variant of ransomware, which they claimed was original, but actually was debunked by researchers to just be based off of Conti version 3. So they're kind of a, reduce, reuse, recycle, other ransomware family type of affiliate. But one thing about DragonForce is the actors seem to really place an emphasis on defense evasion. So they're very well known to use the bring your own vulnerable driver, or BYOVD technique, that's included in the more recent version of their ransomware. And we've also seen them carry a range of different antivirus killers targeting Sophos protections. In terms of impacted sectors, manufacturing is by far the most targeted sector that we see within our customer base, accounting for almost 50% of incidents targeting Sophos customers in the last month. And this, in part, is because of how wide-ranging the manufacturing sector is when it comes to both, product variety and the size of the organizations. With that, downtime is expensive. So ransomware actors know that targeting manufacturing could possibly yield a quicker payout, and that manufacturing companies are just typically less likely to change out and patch their older systems in fear of it disrupting their operations. So that makes them very attractive to threat actors. We also saw heavy targeting of the consulting sector, which is also very wide-ranging and includes things like legal consulting and engineering consulting. And also connected to that is the targeting of information technologies, so many of which are IT consulting organizations and thus are also connected to the overall targeting of the consulting sector. But consulting organizations are also very attractive to threat actors because they often work with and have access to very high-profile clients and have trusted connections that can be abused. And they also have sensitive data, especially that related to their clients, that attackers may want to steal, which also makes them an attractive target. But now that we've gone over some trends, let's dive into some more specific observed threat activity. So the first one that we're going to discuss here is an overarching tactic that we've observed being used by threat actors. And Sophos actually has blogs on this kind of activity dating back to 2020. So this is by no means a new tactic, but we do continue to see it regularly. And what that tactic is a threat actor installing a virtual machine, or a VM, on a compromised host, mounting files inside, and then running malware from within the isolated VM. And what that does is the malware or the ransomware executes in a different environment. So it's essentially, quote unquote, out of reach for EDRs and antivirus products on the physical host system. Thus, it masks its IOCs and it avoids behavioral detection tools. And it also reduces logging and forensic evidence on the host machine itself. And to highlight kind of what this actually means, we're going to be talking about two recent incidents that we've seen variations of this technique. So the first involves VMware Player. And in this incident, initial access is attributed to the cluster that I just mentioned earlier, Stack 3524, involving threat actors brute forcing Sophos VPN credentials. And once they gained access, the threat actor actually uses Google Chrome to search for download VMware Player free, and then actually downloads the VMware Player installer onto the system. After that, the threat actor uses Google Chrome again to search for download Kali Linux and downloads that onto the system. They then use a 7-zip executable to extract Kali Linux VMware and create a directory that contains a Kali Linux VM that the attacker was running through the VMware Player. So the threat actor then executes the VMware Player and executes commands to start the Kali Linux VM with specified settings and configurations to run like they want it to. And then using that Kali virtual machine, they download a tool called netexec, as well as a tool called secrets dump, and they try to dump the registry to access credentials, which is detected by our creds4h detection. And we also had detections for the in-packet activities. So that's one thing, is even though the threat actors used VMware to try to evade detections, they still targeted the same underlying credential mechanism that triggered the behavioral detections, which allowed MDR response actions to prevent any further activity there. And in this second incident that we're going to be talking about, has to do with the QEMU VM. And so with this incident, initial access was actually gained through social engineering that began with the target user receiving numerous spam emails. And we've talked about this initial access several times in the past, I believe. But what happened is after they received all of those spam emails, the user then received a phone call from the threat actor who had spoofed the organization's phone number and was impersonating the IT help desk. And, using those unsolicited spam emails as a pretext to provide remote support, the threat actor, used social engineering to convince the user to download Microsoft Quick Assist that they were then able to use to gain access to their system. And once they were able to gain access to the system, they then downloaded a virtual machine emulator called QEMU, which would then be used to establish a backdoor to the compromised host using the QDoor Trojan. So the malicious VBS script was actually executed on the system, which then executed an executable that successfully configured a virtualized Windows 7 operating system onto the device. So the virtual machine actually had the QDoor Trojan, which is a backdoor already pre-installed on the VM, and they began to launch lateral attacks across the network from this virtualized device. And this attack chain was quite complex. They were seen deploying 4 different remote monitoring and management agents and a range of different toolings, and it ended up resulting in the deployment of 3AM ransomware. However, the customer that was impacted had Sophos protections enabled across most of their devices, so CryptoGuard was able to contain the encryption impact to only one unmanaged device. But when it comes to the advice here and general recommendations, one of which is limiting IP addresses that can access the Sophos firewall management portal. And this has to do with the initial access that we saw in the VMware player incident. So SSL VPN portals are public facing by design. And so threat actors, regularly scan the internet for them to find vulnerable accounts to exploit. So restricting access to the firewall's web admin and user portal, which includes the SSL VPN login page, to only specific trusted IP addresses like internal IPs or known static IPs, really reduces the organization's risk of having their accounts brute forced and credential stuffing attacks that can allow an attacker to gain unauthorized access to the network. And with that, also enforcing application control for unused VM platforms and virtualization software. So, you can use AppC to block or restrict installation of VM platforms and virtualization software like VirtualBox, VMware, QEMU, which will prevent VM abuse, such as in these cases. And, overall, just kind of a general wide-ranging recommendation of, allowing users to download and install software from online resources can always be risky. So, placing blocking restrictions in terms of where and how users can install software can prevent abuse such as this. Next, moving on to our next topic that we're going to talk about here, which is related to the SOC Ghoulish loader. And SOC Ghoulish is also known as fake updates. So you might have heard that referred to, SOC Ghoulish or fake updates. And these campaigns are known to leverage compromised websites and generally a fake browser update theme to deliver a malware zip archive, generally containing a highly obfuscated JavaScript loader. And how this is done is the threat actor injects malicious scripts into a compromised site to try to hijack user traffic. And so when users visit these compromised sites, they're redirected to web pages impersonating legit browser update notifications. And then using social engineering tactics, users are convinced to download a malicious zip file containing a JavaScript file, which is the SOC Ghoulish loader. And the sock goalish file employs a range of evasion techniques that enable it to bypass more traditional signature-based detection methods. And the primary objective of the sock goalish loader is to essentially drop second stage payloads, such as backdoors or things like Cobalt Strike. And it also has the ability to exfiltrate sensitive data. And in the case that we observed, threat actors leveraged a compromised law firm website from which the targeted user downloaded the JavaScript file update.js. And the file was assessed by Sophos Labs to be an obfuscated JavaScript that targets older browsers and disables antivirus and other security features. And it also has the ability to download additional code from an external domain and execute the downloaded response. MDR also observed the unzipping and installation of a Python zip file that contained a Python binary that was seen reaching out to malicious C2 destinations. The malware infection overall, though, was detected by CRED's 3B behavioral protections, which prevented the credential dumping and blocked the infection from going any further. And open source intelligence on similar activity aligning with this does suggest that this attack chain likely would have evolved into the deployment of Ransom Hub ransomware without the protection and the response of Sophos MDR in this case. When it comes to advice, you can significantly reduce your exposure to sock goalish by blocking or at least tightly controlling Windows scripting interpreters like Windows Script Host, also known as WScript, and PowerShell as well. So you can use group policy to block script hosts, and you can use application control to restrict PowerShell to, only signed scripts or, just block it entirely. And with that, since sock goalish is often distributed through these compromised legitimate websites, it is important to monitor and patch vulnerabilities for content management systems and their plugins, because these compromised websites that they're using are usually running popular content management systems like WordPress. And, these sites aren't compromised through the site owner's intent, but because they're usually running unpatched CMS cores, they're have vulnerable third-party plugins or themes, or they're using outdated admin panels with weak credentials. So how you can avoid compromised sites, the CMS platforms frequently patch their critical security flaws. So it's really important to stay on top of these updates and enable automatic updates where possible. And if not, manually checking these plugins and themes that don't auto update to make sure you're up to date. And with that, also just delete plugins that are no longer needed, that you aren't using anymore, or delete them if they haven't been updated in 6+ months, since those are may have unpatched vulnerabilities or have abandoned developer support and thus would be vulnerable to abuse. And then this last observed threat activity topic that we're going to talk about also involves compromised websites, but this campaign or deployment scheme is called ClickFix. And so ClickFix is a term describing a malware deployment scheme that was first spotted in attacks last year and has been increasingly reported on. And essentially, we've talked about ClickFix attacks in the past, but what they do is they use fake CAPTCHA pages to social engineer users into executing malicious scripts in the Windows Run dialog. So in the case that we observed, the user had Googled searching for a lawyer, like you can see in the top screenshot there. And then the user then clicks on one of the lawyer website links and is immediately served a fake CAPTCHA asking the user to prove that they're not some sort of bot. And then upon clicking on the CAPTCHA, it asks the users to complete, certain verification steps, which includes pasting a PowerShell code into the Windows Run dialog. And this leads to the execution of malicious code. And MDR detected this compromise in the initial stages of the attack and detected on the PowerShell usage, because in this case, the PowerShell script contained base64 encoded PowerShell, which uses DGA, also known as domain generation algorithm, to create a random/different domain every day. And what DGA does is it makes it much harder for researchers to find the real C2s that are being used and to track the full infrastructure, since the domains are constantly changing and only the attacker knows which domain is live at a given moment. So that definitely can be complex to track from a defender perspective. But that is not the only, PowerShell scripts are not the only thing that we see deployed in these instances. We've seen click-fix and this fake CAPTCHA tactic lead to multiple different info stealers and commodity malware. Most frequent of which that we've talked about in the past is Luma Stealer, but we've also seen it lead the deployment of Net Support Rat and Vidar Stealer. And while the screenshots here show like a blank gray page behind the CAPTCHA, in many cases, the user will actually be able to see the original website blurred behind the CAPTCHA, which lends kind of to the social engineering component and makes it more believable and likely for the user to click on it. So when it comes to recommendations here, we have detections, but really nothing replaces employee education when it comes to social engineering and phishing attempts like this. So Greg is really going to go more into depth into how to, spot phishing attempts such as this. But you can also disable the WinR command through GPO if not needed. And this will really prevent users from being tricked into launching these dangerous commands, scripts, or URLs. Make sure your help desk or, power users don't rely on, the Windows Run interface for legitimate purposes. And if needed, you can apply this policy only to standard user groups, not admins or IT staff. But alternatively, you can also monitor and restrict what can be executed via the Windows Run dialog. So, allowing basic tools, but blocking PowerShell. And like I said, Greg is going to go more into this in the MDR Most Wanted section. But I think that wraps things up for us here, and I'm going to pass it over to Threat Hunt.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Morgan. Hello, everyone. We have a few hunts that we prepared for this month's ThreatCast that we're going to highlight. So let's just dive right into it. The first one is going to be talking a little bit about a method that threat actors have used to actually package up a tunnel, a secure tunnel that the VS Code utilizes to deploy remotely their malicious payloads. So in this case, the actual hunt itself is looking for that specific hypothesis in that specific scenario, even though most of this activity is done utilizing legitimate or at least non-malicious by nature tools, and we'll kind of dive into that and talk about why that works and how it works. So let's talk a little bit about VS Code as a whole. So VS Code is an environment, development environment used within the Microsoft infrastructure and architecture to both develop and deploy code and applications. Widely used, legitimate, obviously, as a software suite. And in this case, one of the capabilities that we wanted to highlight and that has been abused by the attackers is a specific extension. And this extension is called the VS Code tunnel. And what a VS Code tunnel does, it enables developers to remotely deploy as well as develop their code utilizing secure tunnels. So in this case, this will be an alternative to something like an SSH protocol being used, or OpenSSH as an open source kind of architecture. The actual extension itself is utilizing what is natively a Microsoft architectural product. VS Code is Microsoft's as well. So in this case, it's everything is utilizing the Microsoft architecture. So there's no need for any sort of custom tooling, external tooling that is being used, or something that is custom made for a specific victim. Everything is used within the context of VS Code. And in this case, the VS Code tunnel, as per the diagram, is used to actually extend the development environment. So the environment itself think of it as kind of extending the sandbox of what VS Code can do onto a remote machine, which enables you to also both develop the code as well as deploy the code and execute it on a remote machine without any sort of intervention from the remote machine's end. So obviously, in this case, this can be abused by the attackers by utilizing that exact architecture. And even though the capabilities of VS Code tunnel both enables UI as like a graphical interface, as well as CLI, command line interface, for a server client infrastructure, we're mainly going to be focusing on the CLI portion because it's obviously less loud and nothing is going to be popping up on the client machine and things like that. So that's a little bit about the VS Code tunnel. So let's talk a little bit about how this can be used by the attackers. There's a project, an open source project called WinSW Wrapper, which is a service wrapper. So what does that mean? This specific wrapper takes an application, a Windows application, and then a set of configuration that is fed into the wrapper through an XML file. This XML file is going to specify what application is being used and executed, what is the location, what are the arguments and the parameters of the application, how the service is going to run, is it going to be on start, is it going to be on demand, all of the things that you would normally configure as part of a service that you're starting on a machine. However, in this case, it's being packaged together with the application itself. So it's kind of like almost like a self-extracting type application or a service. And then once that is all packaged and executed, the application itself becomes a Windows server. This is a very popular way to package applications to run as services, because the services generally will have elevated privileges that will run on startup and things like that, enable some additional capabilities for an application. So you can kind of already see where I'm going with this and how this is all going to combine together. So if we were to combine those two elements together, we have the VS Code tunnel. So you have a remote way to deploy and execute code, and you have a open source service wrapper that takes the actual application itself alongside with all the parameters and then packages it as a service. You can see how this can be used and abused by threat actors. So if we actually go through a few portions of this will be an example of the XML configuration file. So the ID portion on the very top, underlined with purple, that talks about the actual name of the service, the application. The executable underneath it is the actual location of the binary itself of the application that is being executed. And then if we go down to the second purple, we actually look at the arguments and how this application is going to execute. And we can see that it's using the tunnel verbose, and it's going to be accepting everything by default and have a random name. So it's basically like a self-extracting, self-enabling type tunnel with no intervention being needed by the client machine, which enables the attackers to run a persistent service that has a tunnel leading back to the server and internal server. So this can be looked at in the context of a C2 infrastructure. And this is why we put on the slide internal C2, because it's an internal device, a server of sorts, that is a VS Code server that is going to be used as kind of like a command center for all the other malicious activities that are being run in that specific infrastructure, in that network, wherever the VS Code tunnel is being deployed onto. So it enables attackers to have not only a foothold onto the environment, but also an ability to laterally move across the environment and to spread their infection vectors wherever they see fit. So a very powerful enablement of an attack, while also utilizing what are native services and native applications that are run on Microsoft. None of these are custom other than the open source wrapper. But again, it's open source. It's being used by many different developers of applications. So there's nothing inherently malicious by it. But when you combine those two capabilities together, this is where the danger comes through. So in terms of the actual hunting itself and how we progressed through this, it was like a two-phase or two-pronged type hunt. The initial query looks at any instances where the wrapper itself, the library that the wrapper uses, the winsw.dll, was being used in the context of the services.exe binary. So we're looking at the original _file name field, which basically means that we're looking for any instances where the attackers may have renamed this library, but the initial name is already kept as part of the metadata. Therefore, we could potentially look for any instances of a rename of the service wrapper being used in the context of the services.exe. Once we kind of have a baseline developed, at least through our hunts, we can start narrowing it down with a second query that basically looks at any instances where malicious code is being used in addition to the tunnel parameter. So in this case, we can customize certain things. We don't even have to use the name of the binary. We can actually look at the name of the signatory as well and look for any signatory of an application that is in the context of VS Code, in addition to using the tunnel as a parameter. Those two together would be a good indicator that this is a VS Code tunnel being executed. And then if we couple that with the wrapper itself being used to schedule a new service to being run, that in and of itself could be an anomalous event that we can kind of take a look at deeper and investigate as to what is the context of its execution. We can continue on with the same topic of services. In this case, we're going to be looking at an interesting argument or parameter that is not commonly being used, at least not until you start looking for it, and then you start finding many instances of it. This is called the failure commands parameter. In this case, the threat actors are using this specific parameter to execute arbitrary code on failure of a service. And we're going to talk a little bit about why this is important and how it can be abused, because this is, again, a capability and a feature of the services as a capability of Windows that is not set by default. It's not a command that is widely presented to somebody who's creating a service, but it's a command that exists, and a capability that does exist, and enables for an execution of a specific binary upon the failure of a service. The failure itself can be either the man-made, or in the sense that it was done by the user itself, or it can be used as an error in the application itself that causes service to terminate. So let's take a look about the actual failure command itself and how it can be used. So again, includes both terminated or failed services. If the user terminates the service, or if the service fails on its own, the failure command parameter will still execute whatever the specified parameter of that is. And so there are various different actions that can be used as part of the failure command context. So the service itself, if it fails due to an error, it can be set to reset automatically, or to reboot device, the system itself, the OS, if it fails. You can also execute a delay. Delay could be used in the sense of a reset, or it can be a delayed execution of a reboot, or an action that is taking place upon the termination of the service. And then highlighted here in bold is what we're primarily interested in, which is also executing a command that can have parameters as well. So we have a few examples here of how this can be set up when you are setting up a service. So the first example talks about the failure action being restart after 5,000 milliseconds, which means that the service will simply just restart upon failure. The second one talks a little bit about a reboot itself. And then it says there's a timer, which is 30 seconds for a reboot, and it will actually come with a message that says, the service has failed because of this, the computer will reboot. So that's another option. But the third one is the interesting one, because in this case, it's actually executing a binary, myservicerecovery.exe. That's not always malicious. There are many services that actually execute some sort of like a log collector, for example, that will actually dump all the logs of the service onto a log file. And then that log file can then be reviewed by the system administrator to see the reason why the service has failed. So that will be a legitimate way to utilize this specific parameter. But obviously, you can tell what the capabilities could possibly be if you are not specifying a log collector, but maybe you're specifying command.exe, PowerShell, to execute a commandlet, something that can be used maliciously. And then you could potentially on purpose fail a service and then execute that command as a means to circumvent certain defensive capabilities of a system. So not sure if you can see this on my screen. It's a little bit tiny, but in this case, this is an example of how it could potentially be abused. The command prompt on the top talks about how the service is being set up, and the failure command is actually executing a specific exe file. In this case, it's a pentestlab.exe. And then once that service is set up, you can actually see in the registry itself that the key under failure command is actually set up to execute a specific binary. So the hunting behind this type of behavior and this type of abuse could be dually hunted for. One would be through looking at the actual modifications to registry through regedit or regadd as a command line. Another one would be to manually actually look at a system. If there is any suspicion that this was actually taking place, looking through the actual registry editor itself, through the registry hive, if you're doing forensics, you can actually query for this specific key and see whether the key itself is containing a binary that you would consider to be anomalous or malicious. You can look at things like a binary living in a temporary folder, userland folder, or potentially a command line itself, cmd.exe, executing specific other binaries as well. You can kind of couple binaries together depending on what kind of interpreter you're actually using. So again, very capable way to execute arbitrary commands through execution of a service that simply utilizes the failure command as a parameter, which is, again, a normal operation for creating new services. So again, in this case, the query that we used initially to look for this kind of behavior, we were looking at the command line entries. In this case, we're looking for the keyword of failure, or SC failure. with a command equals. Command equals just indicates that there is going to be an execution of a command, and that command usually involves some sort of a binary.exe or maybe a batch file that is going to execute that. And in this case, we focus mainly on the userland and the temporary folders themselves, because we find that there are many applications that utilize this capability for executing their own binaries. So in this case, we wanted to make sure that we're focusing on the more anomalous ways to execute a binary. So, and in this case, again, we're going to also be doing some filtering, because there are some instances where our restart is also added to it, which would nullify the actual malicious capabilities of this specific capability. So we wanted to ensure that we exclude that from our results. So yeah, just an interesting methodology that we stumbled upon. I think that's all from me.
There we go. Wouldn't let me come on stage. I found it really interesting because, like, I've used Linux systems for way too long, and Systemd has that kind of functionality. It's rather obvious you'd expect it in any kind of daemon kind of tool. But it's just fascinating. I did not know that was in Windows, and yeah. Thank you, Pavlo, for looking out on that, and I hope you find any weird activity if it turns up on my machine with that one, because I have never looked at that registry, and I spent way too much time in regedit in my years. Right, okay, let's talk about the Sophos MDR Most Unwanted. So this section, I bring it in from time to time. It's backed by popular requests, and also because there's some relevant stuff that Morgan was talking about, but this is effectively a shareable image that we're going to add to the Sophos MDR community that you can just pass on to your end users. One of the things that we're talking about here most of the things we're talking about here are things that help you as like an IT administrator, as a security professional, and so on, to do, things and actions that will help, put up your posture as an organization as a whole. But there's that point that is very hard to improve with the end users. So this is kind of there to give you something to pass on to the end users. And we'll also put the raw text as well in the post if you want to take it. You can take the images, reuse it, do what you need with it. It's totally up to you. So this time around, we've talked about this before, and I've put the same text as I've talked about before, but I've had some additional examples. But we're really focusing in on that sort of fake capture phishing. So ClickFix was the example we talked about this time. But again, we're just sort of talking about what it is on the left. That actors are out there making these fake security checks that are prompting you to press Windows R to open up the run dialog and Control V to paste in the code. Now, not all of you will know about that. So, Win R is something that, I don't even use that. I just open up a shell or a terminal, but it's still there in Windows. As Morgan talks about, you should definitely, if you don't need it, go block it via GPO, but this is still going to impact end users when they're at home. So we're talking about what is this kind of vector. Don't do it. If you ever see it, let your IT or security team know to go block that website if you see it, especially since it's legitimate websites being compromised to sort of serve out this. But I've got some other examples here on the right. There's various other permutations of this. There's like a fake error message for Google Chrome, and a fake error message for like Facebook saying something's wrong, and so it says, oh, you need to type in this command, copy the fix, paste it, and so on. There's ones for like PDF like conversion websites, fake ones of those, and there's plenty of other things. I've seen this actually out in the wild in a variety of websites where a legitimate site just gets taken over. There we go, my camera decided to start off. I've seen legitimate websites get compromised like this and serve these things up. And another kind of permutation, I think Morgan probably did mention on it, but is you'll see the dialogue, but they blur the original website out behind. And if you recognize that website like I did, I was like, oh, this is legit, until I saw Win R, and thankfully I know, don't do that. But again, we need to make sure our end users know about this. User awareness training. There's things like Sophos Phish Threat. You can set up these kind of campaigns, try and get your users to fail safely when being phished. But yeah, nothing's really going to beat than getting your users educated on what these things are, especially as they seem to be sort of evolving. Anyway, with that, we've hit the Q&A section. So let's see, there is a whole bunch of questions. I'd see we've got like 10 minutes of time. So we're going to tackle a few which I thought were interesting because they're talking about sort of threat actors that we haven't touched on here, but are popping up in the news. I think the first one I'm going to take, though, is if any of my Intel and Hunt experts want to pop on and talk about this. So the first one is, what are you seeing as a result of the most recent VM update? So there's a vulnerability in VM. I think it was, I had this open a second ago. It was 2025 23120. It was a 9.9 crit remote code execution, still being scored by NIST, but the hacker one put one out, but pretty nasty. I think POC code's out there, but yeah, if one of the team wants to come in and give some insights or thoughts. Give them a second. Takes a while to bounce off of the backstage to come on stage. Here we go. Here's Morgan.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think we've seen exploitation of that specific vulnerability, though we do see VM targeted quite frequently in order to access those backups. Hopefully, in regards, I believe Dan can come on and confirm this, but I believe that he said that that vulnerability has not been seen exploited in the wild quite yet. So hopefully, as a result of the most VM update, nothing happens and we see no compromises, but that might just be wishful thinking. Dan, what did you, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, just to kind of go off what you said there. There's not seen anything yet saying it's been actively exploited in the wild. There is some good technical reports out explaining the vulnerability in detail. And then, like Greg said, there's some POC available. So it wouldn't surprise me if it happens soon. So if you are infected by this vulnerability, there's a patch available. But yeah, nothing really further on that in terms of exploitation at this point.
Yeah. I think another part of it is you have to be an authenticated domain user. So whereas like seeing this kind of thing, I mean, we often see stuff, especially if it's exposed to the internet, that's going to get popped and exploited very quickly. But when it's something that's going to be sat probably within the environment that you need to be authenticated to, is probably a little bit more of a barrier. But again, we'll probably see that popped. So yeah, keep your eyes on the news, and if we have any updates, I'll probably tell up in the ThreatCast next month. The next one we had was I heard Medusa Group is on the rise and is hard to detect. So this is another ransomware gang. Have you guys seen that? Now, we've seen them back in 2024, but yeah, there's I don't want to steal the thunder of Royal Intel, guys. Someone want to come and talk to the Medusa question?
Yeah, I can speak on that a little bit as well. I know some other members of the team have looked into this a little bit more than I have. So, if any of them want to jump in and talk about it, please feel free. But with the release of the CISA advisory, I believe, updated version in March, we definitely have been increasing hunts and detections in terms of Medusa Locker. We have seen cases outside of the MDR customer base. So to my knowledge, no MDR customers have been impacted by Medusa Locker that we've seen quite yet. However, we have seen some activity related to exploiting vulnerabilities in Simple Help. I know Jordan has done some investigation into that. Do you have any additional input, Jordan, into that?
Yeah, so in ThreatCast's past, you may have heard us talk about Stack 4461. This is a threat actor that we observed exploiting Simple Help, especially related to a specific vendor. This was a piece of software that they had not updated and pushed out a new version for their Simple Help version. And lo and behold, this started getting exploited in the wild. And sure enough, the reason we started looking into this is that we got an influx of detections for Medusa ransomware. So that was, I think we had 3 cases within 24 hours, and that was a red flag. So that kind of kicked off the investigation that created Stack 4461 for us. Thankfully, in all cases, the detections worked beautifully. Ransomware was prevented in all cases. And it's a little bit interesting. This is actually a threat actor that we'd seen in the past, dropping a different type of ransomware. In those cases, it was a version of the Lockbit ransomware that was built using a leaked builder. And it looks like this group has now joined up with Medusa. So it looks like Medusa has got a new affiliate, and they are out there exploiting vulnerable exposed services. So another reason to keep your exposed services patched.
Nice, thanks, Jordan. The next one, I think we talked about backstage. I'll try and rattle it off because I've got 5 minutes. But they said, "Hey there, do you have any news about Van Helsing ransomware as a service? Are there any targets amongst Sophos customers?" So I don't believe we see anything, at least in the MDR side of things. I mean, I know that their payloads are being detected by labs, and of course, we're here from MDR, so we kind of talk to our sort of perspective of what we see post sort of prevention, right? So we're looking at the activity when it's not blocked, or when it's somehow evaded, or unprotected assets. And so in general, I mean, there's so many different variants of like sort of ransomware payloads. We have got those kind of multiple layers of prevention. CryptoGuard detects a lot of stuff. In terms of like, I think the Van Helsing specifically, I've already seen detections go out from labs which are static, which means like the payloads are being spotted. But even when it's polymorphic, there's additional layers with like CryptoGuard and so on. But yeah, I don't think we saw Van Helsing specifically in MDR or any instance. So good sign. As always, if we haven't seen it, we don't have a ton of insight. The best thing you can take away from that is it's not got or escalated to the point where we end up having to dig into it, right? Which means prevention's done a good job. Another question we got, which is what settings or mitigations can protect against polymorphic browser extensions or malicious browser extensions? So, I mean, there's a bunch of approaches you can take. I think the best one, and the one I'm going to focus on now, is Firefox, Google Chrome, I'm sure Edge and all the others have group policy templates available. So you can go and actually configure and control these browsers at an organization level. You can also do this even on Macs. I'm sat here at Sophos on my Mac, where it is being managed by the browser, and the browser extensions are managed by my IT department, which means I can't install a bunch of stuff. So you can effectively say no to all extensions bar these specific subsets. So that's your best bet. If you're concerned about browser extensions, you can either just set the group policy template and configure it to not allow your users to use extensions at all, or if there are specific ones that you want to use in your organization, you want to allow those, then go and set those into your policy. But again, go check it out. I don't think you're going to see them by default. You need to go get the templates from the vendors. I imagine Edge, for instance, is already there in group policy, but when it comes to like Firefox, Chrome, you want to go get those templates from them, and then you can go and put those as a group policy and then set some settings for it. But very handy way of doing it. The last one I think we've got time for is you mentioned DragonForce using bring your own vulnerable driver attacks to disable endpoint protections. Have you seen any success against Sophos without temper protections? So, I mean, the problem with bring your own vulnerable drivers, especially if the actor's got the ability to run a system and run a driver, which is then running at kernel level, it depends on the driver, but of course, without tamper protection, it's very possible they can actually then disable certain components, which of course is a cool thing to go look at and a signal to go and investigate. With tamper protection, I believe it's limited. The best thing you can go and do is go check out Sophos News. We put out some pieces around like EDR Killer by Andreas Klops, which was last year, can't remember when, but look up EDR Killer, so search Sophos EDR Killer, you'll find the article. There's been a few pieces that we put out from our sort of threat researchers that have looked into this, which will give you a wider perspective on bring your own vulnerable drivers and various other tools that are used in the same context to disable EDR products and so on, because that is a key need for most threat actors now, is that these products are sending so many points of telemetry to people like ourselves that it's very hard for them to evade detection unless they target the very things collecting that data and sending it. And I'll give you a wider perspective and of course talk about the detections and so on. But again, yeah, there's so many different ways you can catch these things. I mean, and again, a lot of the time, once these drivers are known, the code signing certificates are revoked. So even at an operating system level, it will be pushed out through a Windows update, and there'll be no more validation of that driver, which is pretty quick. Which is something that's not to do with us. My camera's got right. There we go. I'm back. But yeah, check that piece out. I think it'll give you a better perspective. We are now at time, so I just wanted to quickly throw on the screen this little thing. So every week we put out the Sophos MDR threat brief. You can find this on the MDR community channel. It is a text post with some images where we kind of summarize the various things going on out there in the threat landscape in the weeks in between the ThreatCast, and we cover many things that we never have an opportunity or the time to talk about during the ThreatCast because there's more pressing things. So make sure you hop over to the community channel, subscribe to that, and get that into your inbox, give you some perspectives on the week to week and things that are changing. And then finally, of course, here's the further reading. All of this will be posted onto the MDR community channel, so you don't have to panic or take screenshots. But I just want to say thank you again for being here. Thank you for taking a concerned interest in cybersecurity, what's going on. And I always say this, but it's what helps us stay one step ahead of the threat actors when we're all here communicating and collaborating together, right? They're all out there doing their thing. We should be here together, working together, communicating and learning and sharing what we know. Until next time, stay safe, stay secure. Stay vigilant, stay suspicious, and if you have any concerns, reach out to Sophos MDR. All right, thanks so much for being here. We'll hopefully see you next month. All right, you take care.